Betrayal hits harder than any bullet. As a WWII pilot, facing death in the skies was nothing compared to discovering my wife's infidelity. Ronnie, the woman I loved and trusted, shattered my heart and left me bleeding in more ways than one. She cheated with another man, and the truth hit me like a freight train. I lost my arm in the war, but her rejection cut even deeper. Her cruelty ignited a fire in me, and my revenge was swift and severe. She never saw it coming. Now, she knows the true cost of betrayal. The general dynamics. F-16V roared past the crowd and into a hard 9G turn that showed why it's the best fighter jet around. Then, without slowing down, the pilot pulled the jet up and fired the afterburner. The jet's powerful engine sent it shooting up into the summer clouds. In almost no time, the F-16 was a tiny dot in the sky. It turned in the air and suddenly appeared behind the crowd, flying low. The noise from the jet shook the ground as the pilot made a wide loop, turning it into a tricky maneuver called a half-Cuban 8, soaring back over the amazed crowd. After a few moments of hearing the jet rumble in the distance, it zoomed past the grandstand again, this time flying upside down. The pilot snapped the jet into a quick roll and disappeared into the clouds, the noise still echoing. The crowd of thousands stood in silence for a second, then erupted into loud cheers. An old man looked at his granddaughter, a lively 14-year-old with a long blonde ponytail sticking out of her Air Force cap. He thought she would be excited, but she had tears in her eyes. The old man asked, "What's wrong, sweetie?" She replied, "Why can't girls do that?" The old man smiled, knowing something she didn't. "Come with me," he said. The girl gave him a look but followed him towards the flight line. The colorful F-16 with snake eyes and fangs had just come to a stop and the engine was winding down. They walked up to the tape barrier. The old man showed his ID and the guard raised the tape for them. "Yes, sir," the guard said respectfully. The crew was getting the maintenance platform ready. After some work with straps, the pilot climbed out of the cockpit and walked down the steps confidently. The granddaughter watched as the pilot took off the helmet, revealing a cascade of blonde hair. The pilot turned and waved to the old man. The girl stood there, shocked. "Well, do you want to meet her or not?" the old man asked. Air Force Major Amy Boho Fuller was the head of the Viper demonstration unit and a true hero. The old man had met her years ago at an event, and they stayed in touch. He said, "Amy, my granddaughter thinks girls can't fly." Major Fuller laughed, handed her helmet to a nearby officer, and said, "Captain, take over." Then she added, "Hasn't your granddad told you about the wasps?" It was a sunny Sunday in Oahu. We were flying over the harbor while the ships below prepared for morning services. We were up early because Ronnie needed one last check ride before she could fly solo. We had stayed up late the night before, but got up early to head to John Rogers Field at Barber's Point for the check ride. I picked the vibrant blue Waco UPF-7 for us. It was a beautiful biplane with a powerful engine, much better than the smaller planes we usually flew. We were in the air as the sun rose over the Pacific. I usually sat beside Ronnie during her practice flights, enjoying both the view and her company. But today was her final test, so I sat in the rear seat like a real instructor. We saw the busy morning activities below as Ronnie practiced landings. She had to fly out over Ford Island each time to join the landing pattern again. Planes didn't have radios back then, so we had to follow strict flight patterns to avoid collisions. Part of the training was learning these patterns and how to watch for other aircraft. Ronnie was at the controls, turning to line up with the runway. I was looking around for other planes when I saw a fighter jet heading straight for us. I quickly took the controls and made a sharp turn. Ronnie screamed as the fighter zoomed past, shaking our plane. I looked back to try and see the fighter's tail number. Pilots were supposed to avoid this airspace. I wanted this guy's fuzzy dice for my rearview mirror. What I saw left me stunned. The fighter plane wasn't one of Hickham's Curtiss P-40Bs with stars and bars on its wings. It was a Mitsubishi A6M0 with the Empire of Japan's rising sun symbol. I turned my head to look back at Pearl Harbor, and black smoke was just starting to rise. The American fleet was under attack. The guy in the Zero scared me out of my wits, but at least I could do something. Forget flying in a pattern, I had to get us on the ground fast because another Zero was lining up to shoot at us. Meanwhile, Ronnie was freaking out in the front. I pushed the throttle all the way and drove the Waco plane into a steep dive. I was glad I had taken the bigger, sturdier plane. In that kind of stress, the wings would have come off a smaller plane. It was also lucky Ronnie had lined us up with the runway because I was aiming for the landing slot at 130 mph, way past the Waco's top speed and very risky for landing. I pulled back on the stick at the last second. The G-force pushed us into our seats. Ronnie screamed again, which was getting annoying, but the Waco made a surprisingly smooth landing. I would have been proud if it weren't for the guy who was trying to kill me. Our sudden slowdown tricked him, and he flew over us without firing. I was sure he would be back. Seconds dragged on as I frantically turned the Waco toward the hangar. When we got there, I hit the brakes, and we came to a shaking stop. Ronnie had the wing to help her get out. Getting out from the back seat was harder. It took me extra time. Ronnie was just disappearing into the hangar when the guy in the Zero started shooting again. I was about 10 yards behind Ronnie when the bullets started to hit around me. I threw up my arms to protect myself. I know it was stupid. Flesh couldn't save me from machine gun and cannon rounds. I saw my left arm as a shell blew it off about 4 inches below the elbow. If it had been a foot to the right, it would have hit my head. A pink mist surrounded me, but I didn't realize what had happened yet. I kept running until I reached the hangar. I say safe because the Japanese were shooting at it. Luckily, the Zeros were flying with Kates and Vals to bomb Pearl Harbor. They didn't have the small bombs they sometimes carried. As I ran into the hangar, Ronnie looked at me, screamed, and fainted. When I looked down, I saw my left side was covered in blood. Then I passed out too. I woke up in a bed in Hickam Hospital, 20 miles away. A Navy nurse taking flying lessons had put a tourniquet on me. She saved my life, but my flying days were over. Congressional Airport was home to the civilian pilot training program for the Washington, D.C. area. You needed a car to get there, but there was always traffic on Rockville Pike, which ran by the place, so you could hitch a ride or take a bus. My father wanted me to go to an Ivy League school after high school, but I was tired of him planning my life. So I signed up for the CPT program without telling anyone. I thought I could be a pilot, and Dad could deal with it. I was full of myself back then. Most 18-year-olds are. I was big and loud, without much sense, which made me do crazy things. The craziest was learning to fly. But I loved it once I did. It cost $35, a lot of money back then. That paid for the medical exam and life insurance. I had the money saved, but the hard part was sneaking off to the airfield without my parents catching on. They probably thought I was sneaking off to meet someone. They would have freaked out if they knew I was learning to fly. A funny double standard, right? Flight instruction happened after ground school. Ground school taught you air regulations, navigation, and weather. Once you passed that exam, you needed 35 hours of flying to get a license. 8 hours of flying with an instructor, 9 hours of check time, and 18 hours of solo flight. I did the flight instruction in a Piper Cub with basic instruments. The engine's maximum speed was 87 miles per hour, so the Cub was gentle and easy to fly. But it was scary being 3,000 feet in the air with just thin steel tubes and fabric holding me up, like a kite. I tried not to think about it. My dad almost lost it when I told him I wanted to fly instead of going to college. In 1940, flyers were seen as daredevils, not heroes. The CPT program wanted to get more people into flying. My parents were typical of their time. Dad worshipped FDR and was a strong Democrat. My mother came from a high-class Virginia family, and she voted for the most conservative candidate. Me? I didn't care which politician was wasting my tax money. I was totally uninterested in politics, and I still am, even though it's funny considering my current job. My dad worked for the Treasury Department. It was a big job, so he made good money and had power. I went to high school at St. Albans, which was a short walk from our home in Georgetown. St. Albans was a boys-only school, so we hung out around Merritt to meet girls. That's where I met Susan. Our schools were close to each other, less than a mile apart. They were both full of rich kids. The yearly soccer game was always a big deal. I was the goalkeeper for St. Albans every year because I didn't know how to say no when they asked me to play. Being a goalie is 99% boring and 1% really scary. You have to dive in front of players charging at you to kick the ball into the net, sometimes risking getting hurt. Back then, goalies didn't have much protective gear. I just wore shorts, a shirt, and a silly hat to show that I was the goalie. That's what I was wearing in my last game as a senior. The referee, who seemed as mean as his black shirt, gave a last-second penalty kick that could tie the game. It was me against Jack Lambertson, a tough guy. As Lambertson got ready to kick, I looked left. He saw me do that, so I knew he would kick to the right. I dove right and stopped the ball, landing on it to cover it up. Lambertson kicked me in the head while following his shot. We won the game, but I was knocked out and didn't get to celebrate. I woke up to the smell of smelling salts. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. My teammates were celebrating far away while the Maret players had left angrily. No one seemed to notice me lying on the ground. Susan, the Maret coach's daughter, also acted as their team's trainer. She was Lambertson's girlfriend, so she was paying close attention. She saw Lambertson look at my body and walk away, satisfied. She ran over with her medical kit and put my head on her lap. When I opened my eyes, she asked, "Are you all right?" I was confused and took a moment to understand. I asked, "Who are you?" It wasn't smooth, but back then they didn't take head injuries seriously. They just told you to shake it off. She replied, "I'm Susan Lawson, the Maret trainer. Just lie here until you feel better." Still a bit dazed, I asked, "What happened?" She said, "You got kicked in the head at the end of the game." I vaguely remembered playing soccer. I asked, "Who won?" She laughed and said, "Does it matter? It's over. Let me help you up." She stood, helped me to my feet, and I took a moment to look at her. She was pretty. Susan smiled and asked, "Like what you see?" I eagerly said, "Oh God, yes." She laughed and shook her head. She helped me to the Maret bench. She fit perfectly under my arm and even smelled nice. We sat while I tried to clear my head. When I finally looked at her face, I saw she had blue eyes, a pretty face, and thick auburn hair. She was gorgeous. I was feeling better and knew it was time to leave. Susan seemed a bit sad, so I asked, "Would you like to go out sometime? I owe you dinner for taking care of me." Susan looked happy but said, "I have a boyfriend, but we can go out as a thank you." We were both fooling ourselves. I asked her to write down her phone number. She didn't have paper, but wrote it on my hand with a pen. I called her the next Tuesday and asked her out for that Saturday. I had a '32 Ford Roadster convertible, which was pretty fast. I grew up with a lot of perks. One of them was a rusty blue convertible that everyone loved. My dad had bought it for $50 and let me use it, but only to keep me in check. Susan lived near the zoo in Woodley Park. Her dad taught at Maret and had a lot of inherited money. Their house was even bigger than mine, like a mansion on a pretty street. Susan's world was perfect, like those old sappy family movies. When I got to her house, her dad greeted me with a cardigan and a pipe. Her mom wasn't around. He hinted that Susan had a boyfriend, who was also his favorite student. So it was a bit tense when Susan entered the room. Susan's dad lit up when he saw her. She looked great, wearing a neat schoolgirl outfit. Her shining hair was tied in 2 ponytails, making her look lively. I could tell Susan's dad didn't trust me. He said, "I want her back by 9:30. Where are you taking her?" Susan, looking amused, replied, "Erik is taking me out to eat to thank me for helping him after the game last Friday." I said, "We're going to Martin's Tavern, sir." I knew it was a place her dad liked, even though it had a shady reputation because many politicians dined there. As we got in my car, Susan asked, "We're not really going to that boring place, are we?" I laughed and said, "No way! I'm taking you somewhere you'll love." Susan didn't press me for details. She seemed curious and was growing on me. Even though she was dating Lambertson, the star athlete, she was fun and smart. A hard combination to ignore. During our 30-minute drive to Rockville, we talked a lot. I learned Susan had big dreams and plans, which made sense since she was the homecoming queen, star of the musical, and top of the class. I wasn't thinking about a future with her. Her love life didn't matter to me, but her story showed she was always pleasing others, especially her parents, who put a lot of pressure on her. On the other hand, was rebellious and didn't care what people thought of me. I always went against the grain. Susan looked confused when I turned onto a rough road and stopped near a big barn. She asked, "Where are we?" I replied, "Right where I planned." She looked skeptical and said, If you think I'm rolling in the hay, you're wrong. I laughed and said, "Follow me." I led her to a small airplane parked in a hangar. Susan was amazed. I told her, "Get in, you'll love it." I helped her into the plane and did a quick check before sitting next to her. My friend Stephen, the mechanic, helped start the engine. Soon we were taxiing out, leaving clouds of smoke behind us. There was no air traffic control there. We just took off when ready. We rolled for a while before the plane lifted off, climbing into the sky at 40 miles per hour. Susan was scared during takeoff, but soon looked thrilled. She turned to me with bright eyes and said, "This is the most exciting thing I've ever done." I smiled, knowing I had made the right choice. Susan was born for adventure. We flew southwest at 1,000 feet, heading toward the Potomac River at the Great Falls. Seeing the view was exciting, even for me. Susan gazed out the open side window, looking down. We were flying at about 50 knots, and she could stick her hand into the wind, which she did now and then. It seemed like she was touching the air gently. She kept giving me joyful glances. She was really into it. I asked her, "Do you want to try it?" She nodded eagerly. I said, "Just follow the river and keep it steady. If you pull back, you go up." And I showed her, "If you want to go down, push the wheel forward." I moved us back to our original height. She grabbed the right-hand wheel and focused hard, her tongue peeking out of the corner of her lips. The trim tabs were doing most of the work. Then a gust of wind hit us. The Taylor craft is light, so it moved us nearly sideways. But Susan didn't panic. She calmly steered us back. I said, "That was great. You're a natural." She gave me a huge smile. I was smart, so I added, "Why don't I give you lessons?" She looked at me with so much longing and said, "Really, you'd do that for me?" I knew she was interested in the flying lessons, not in me. But teaching Susan to fly would let me into more of her life. I was qualified as an instructor for the CPT program, and we always looked for new students. So I said, "We can fill out the papers when we get back. Meanwhile, let's tour Georgetown." We reached Chain Bridge by then. I took over and flew along the Palisades until we reached the university, where I dropped down to 150 feet. You couldn't do that now, but things were less regulated back then. It gave us a fantastic view of M Street. There was traffic, bars, and restaurants busy with people, and the city lights were coming on. I took a detour on our way back to Rockville, thinking Susan would enjoy flying over her house. So, I dropped to 100 feet. She sounded upset and said, "That's Jack's car in the driveway." Her mom must have called her boyfriend when Susan left. Susan would need to explain when we got back. I hoped Lambertson would act badly enough to push her my way. I almost laughed. It was dusk when we landed. There were no lights on the field, so it was a bit tricky. We rolled up and stopped. Susan just sat there in the fading light. I asked, "What's wrong?" She said sadly, "I don't want this to end." I said, "It doesn't have to. We can arrange lessons. Just call me and we can set them up." I was a certified instructor, and CPT paid me for each student I recruited. So it was good for both of us. Susan filled out the papers, then pulled out $40 from her purse. I had to save for 6 months to get that much money. Lambertson stayed in the house when I dropped her off. I was a lot bigger than him. She said, "Jack's going to be angry, but he doesn't own me. I'll call you as soon as things settle down here." I watched her walk up the steps to her house, feeling pangs of jealousy. She waved at me longingly before going inside. I never heard from Susan. Maybe her parents or Lambertson got in the way, but the phone never rang. I didn't view it as betrayal since we didn't make any promises. Things just happen. Still, it bummed me out, and I spent a couple of weeks wondering what could have been. I realized that hoping for a long-term relationship was a fantasy. Susan was too tied to her current life, and she always said she was Lambertson's girl. Plus, teenage boys like me don't focus on one thing for long, so I soon forgot about my crush. Meanwhile, I told my parents I was going to be a full-time instructor with the CPT instead of going to Princeton. That got me kicked out of the house. My dad told me, "If you want to be your own man, you have to support yourself." I didn't mind. The CPT paid $80 a month, more than most households made then, and it got me away from my parents. So I took a job in Fort Collins, Colorado right away. Looking back, I realize it was a selfish and ungrateful act because it almost broke my mother. But at 18, like most boys, I was self-centered and had a dream. I wanted to fly. I would have laughed if someone told me getting up at 4:30 in the morning and working until 8 p.m. could be fun. That was until I got to Fort Collins. But I loved my work as an instructor, and all the flying made me a much better pilot. The practical reason for taking that job was to learn how to fly at high altitudes. Just taking off in Fort Collins was like flying at 5,000 feet in Rockville. So you learn to handle thin air. Plus, the winds in the Rockies could be challenging. But I grew up in Maryland, and one cold, snowy winter in Fort Collins convinced me to take a similar job in Hawaii. Honolulu was a lively place in October 1941. The city was buzzing with activity because of all the military people around. It was way more exciting than the quiet and sleepy Fort Collins. But the real excitement began when Veronica McMartin walked in the door the week I started my new job at Andrews Flying. Ronnie, as she liked to be called, seemed like trouble from the moment she entered the office. Some people just have that look about them, like they think they own the place and it's annoying to everyone else. Ronnie was one of those people. My manager, Jake Hill, saw her and muttered, "Uh-oh." Then he looked at me and said, "You deal with this one." I groaned, "Why me?" I watched as Hill greeted Ronnie and then brought her over to me. She was stunning, and we stared at each other. Ronnie had an exotic look, being half Japanese and half Anglo, with long, smooth black hair. Her dark eyes had an Asian touch and sparkled with deep attractiveness. She gave me a look that seemed to size me up. Our attraction to each other was intense. I'm taller than average, with unruly brown hair, gray eyes, and a long face. Ronnie had a perfect oval face with high cheekbones, a small pointed chin, and a wide, appealing mouth. But the most striking thing about her was her fit body with amazing legs. She wore stylish flying clothes popularized by Amelia Earhart, camel pants and a leather jacket over one shoulder. The jacket seemed odd for Hawaii, but it gets cold up in the sky. The loose pants fit her hips and backside like they were made for her. Her white silk blouse highlighted her figure. Hill introduced her. "Erik, this is Veronica McMartin." I tore my gaze from her, and she smiled as she said, "Call me Ronnie." Trying to seem composed, I replied, "I'm Erik." But we both knew we were interested in each other. Our flying lesson started off rocky. I walked Ronnie out to the tarmac where a Piper J3 was ready. The Piper was the standard plane for beginner flights. It had seats one behind the other, with controls in the front and a stick and throttle in the back. While I checked the plane, Ronnie got in the front seat. I told her, "You sit in the back for these flights." She replied, "I'm paying and I want to sit up front." I explained, "The rudder pedals are only in the front. You have to sit in the back." She stubbornly stayed where she was. I sighed and said, "I can't steer the plane from the back seat, so either move or the lesson is over before it starts." Ronnie glared at me, got out of the front, and moved to the back. I thought to myself, what a spoiled person. I sat in the front seat and said, "Put on the headset so we can talk during the flight." She did, looking annoyed. She was clearly used to getting her way. The mechanic and I started the plane, and we taxied out. I told her over the intercom, "Put your right hand on the stick and your left hand on the throttle. Just feel the movements during this flight." I revved the engine, and we took off at a slow 40 miles per hour. I leveled off at 1,000 feet, cruising at 60 miles per hour, and flew over the Pacific Ocean, explaining as we went towards Pearl Harbor. Ronnie had been quiet, but I could feel her hand on the stick as I moved it. I played with the engine speed as we descended. Alarmed, Ronnie asked, "What's wrong with the engine?" I laughed and told her, "I'm just keeping the oil temperature up. You'll learn all this soon." We landed and taxied slowly back. I turned off the ignition and fuel. For a moment it was quiet, then Ronnie's voice came over the intercom. "Would you like to come to my place for a drink? To celebrate?" I turned to see her eyes filled with desire. Ronnie's quick change didn't surprise me. Some women are attracted by the thrill and dependency they feel in a plane. She was clearly excited. I thought, why not? She was attractive, and I was young and interested. Plus, I never turned down a chance for fun. I said, "Sure, let's go." But I usually biked to work. I did own an old Chevy, but it was at home, so I had no way to get to her place. When I told her, she simply said, "I'll drive." I still wasn't sure what she had in mind, but she seemed eager. We walked out to the parking lot, and there I saw a classy maroon 1939 Oldsmobile coupe. I said. "Nice car." She replied with a bitter tone. "I got it from my ex in the divorce. Not married." Now that was interesting. Ronnie had always seemed unfriendly toward men. It takes about 30 minutes to drive from Barbers Point to Makiki, mostly because you have to go all the way around Pearl Harbor. During the drive, we talked to get to know each other. That's when I learned Ronnie was 8 years older than me. It may not sound like a big difference, but it meant she had much more life experience than I did. Ronnie was born in Hawaii, making her a U.S. citizen by law, even though Hawaii didn't become a state until 18 years later. Her dad was a colonel at Fort Shafter, so she grew up on the base surrounded by soldiers. This likely made her feel very important. Ronnie was very beautiful, and people noticed her even before she turned 16. Though her dad's position kept most soldiers away, Captain Roger McMartin wasn't like the others. He was charming and worked directly with Ronnie's dad, which gave him special access to her. McMartin knew how to win women over, and Ronnie, at 18, was inexperienced compared to him. He played on her vanity and inexperience to win her over. Surprisingly, he became enamored with her passion and married her. Their marriage lasted 7 years. As we drove, Ronnie said, "I tried to be a good wife, but I was too young and he could never stay faithful." She looked sad as she continued, "I caught him cheating and he promised to stop. But when I caught him with my cousin, I knew it was time to leave." She added with a hint of satisfaction, "His family had plantations up by WWII. My dad used military rules to get the most out of him, including my car and house." Ronnie was a 7th grade teacher at Punahou, but her house was in nearby Makiki Heights, an expensive area even back then. It was a large, 1-story house with beautiful landscaping and a driveway made of crushed lava. From that elevation, you could see for miles. Her nice house showed she got a lot out of her divorce. I, on the other hand, lived in Iwe Beach, an area mostly populated by Asians and Pacific Islanders. The houses there were affordable, so I was able to buy a small beachfront house, though it was not in the best condition. Ronnie opened her door made of carved wood, and we walked into a large living area with fancy furniture and a great view of the ocean through big windows. I had been in charge during our flight, but this was her domain now. She asked, "What do you want to drink?" I asked for a Primo, a local beer. She brought me a cold bottle and got a glass of wine for herself. I felt she was just getting the formalities out of the way. We walked out onto the balcony with a beautiful view of Pearl Harbor and the ships docked there. The breeze carried the sweet smell of flowers, and it gently moved Ronnie's long hair. The warm sun made the scene feel serene and detached from the busy life on the base. Ronnie's beauty was striking, with a perfectly shaped face and large, dark eyes that made her even more special. Her eyes were looking at me with a mix of desire and challenge. As we stood side by side, sipping our drinks and looking at the harbor, Ronnie took my beer and set it down with her wine. Her eyes told me something was about to happen. I still didn't really understand how I ended up in this situation. It all happened so fast. But Ronnie was a determined woman. She had decided to enjoy an afternoon with her young flight instructor without worrying about the consequences. Her strong desires were warning signs, but I was too young and naive to heed them. Ronnie grabbed the back of my head and kissed me hard. She moaned, and her mouth opened as we kissed deeply. I had experienced a lot of fleeting romances during my 2 years flying for the CPT. It was a perk of the job, yet this was still surprising and a little unsettling. Even so, I knew when to take charge. Ronnie's house was open and airy, with bedrooms off the main space. I took her hand and led her gently toward the nearest bedroom. Her excitement was obvious, which was a good sign. I stopped next to the bed and looked directly into her eyes. She stood there, breathing hard as I undressed her slowly. Her eyes were filled with desire. I'll always remember revealing Ronnie's perfect body. Everything about her was just right. The rise and fall of her breaths was like the gentle movements of the Pacific Ocean. Ronnie was clearly very excited. And that, my friends, is how Ronnie McMartin and I got together. We were just two people who liked flying and spending time together. It wasn't really love. It was more like a strong desire. It could have been something more, but then the war started. The hospitals were full of wounded soldiers and civilians. I wasn't in critical condition, so I was left on a stretcher in a crowded hallway. My left arm was tied to a board with an IV drip in it. A doctor had treated my arm, making it look like I had a club instead of a hand. The pain would have been bad, but they gave me strong painkillers. I was lying there, feeling sorry for myself, when Ronnie showed up and made things worse. I saw her walking down the hall. She looked cool and beautiful. Ronnie stopped and stood there. She looked like she was preparing for something unpleasant. I gave her a silly smile. I was very high on the medication. She said, sounding worried, "Oh, Erik, how terrible. Will you be okay?" I mumbled, "I'm fine except for the blood loss." I nodded at my club-like hand and added, "I broke my throttle hand so I can still fly." I reached for her and she pulled back. I asked, confused, "What?" Ronnie hesitated and then blurted out, "It's been fun, Erik, but I can't get the image of you covered in blood out of my head." I stared at her, shocked. What was she saying? She continued, "And the thought of you touching me with that stump creeps me out. So, it's better that we end it." Maybe it was the drugs, but I whined, "End it? What do you mean?" Ronnie gave me an angry look. She said coldly, "I can't even look at you, let alone be with you. We're done, over. Don't try to contact me." She gave me a pat on the shoulder, turned, and walked away. I should have seen it coming. I knew she was selfish, and we had little in common. We both liked to fly and be together physically. That was it. Still, being hurt and then dumped in the hospital crushed me. It wasn't until later that I realized this was the moment my life started to change. Ronnie showed me what I really was, a selfish, childish man without direction or care for others. Even worse, I wasn't doing anything useful for society. All my choices up to that point were about making myself happy. That's why I chose to be a flyer instead of going to college. My parents were very upset about that, but I didn't care. I loved flying. Flying led me to a bad relationship with a troubled woman. I had a moment of realization while lying in that bright, bare hallway. Good people take responsibility for their lives, and I had only cared about myself so far. I decided I needed to be more responsible both for myself and for everyone else. I saw that the future would have more wars, and I had been shot early on. So what should I do next? Injured people kept coming in, and they were moving fast to help them. My arm was neatly cut off by a 20 mm shell, and they sewed skin over the end. Now my left arm looked like the end of a sausage. After they gave me more blood, they let me go. Since the military couldn't use me anymore, I needed to get home. But many people were trying to leave Hawaii, making it hard to get on a ship. I sent a telegram to my dad asking for help. Maybe this was the first sign I had started to grow up. He got me a spot on a Navy supply ship going back to San Francisco. I knew the trip would be dangerous. The aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were still out there, and there were always submarines. So, I sent a letter to my parents in case I didn't make it. I told them I loved them and was sorry for being so difficult. They didn't deserve my bad attitude, and I promised to make up for it, even if they welcomed me back with open arms. To my surprise, when I got back to Georgetown, I found out I was a minor celebrity. I was the first person to return home injured from Pearl Harbor, but the real heroes were still serving or had died there. Politicians wanted to use my fame to their advantage. So I was busy for a few weeks after I got home. This included a planned visit with Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House. That's why I was standing in my best suit with my parents when the First Lady walked into the East Room. By then, Eleanor Roosevelt was more popular than her husband. She was very smart and good at connecting with people, so she wasn't surrounded by a big group of important-looking people. It was just an older woman walking into the room, followed by some reporters. We had a planned public talk about civilians being at Pearl Harbor during the attack. Reporters took photos and shouted questions. The First Lady handled it all with grace. Then, after the reporters left, she wanted to talk to me alone. That was the kind of person she was. During our talk, she asked me a question that changed my life. "What are you going to do now?" I replied honestly, "I'd love to serve, but no branch will take me with one arm." I added sadly, "I was a good pilot and instructor, and I wish someone would let me help in the war." The First Lady gave me a thoughtful look and asked, "Can you still fly?" I showed her my left arm. It wasn't like Captain Hook's hook. It even had a watch on it. It was attached to a leather sleeve that I put over my stump every morning. It was secured around my elbow by a harness. The plastic looked like skin, and people wouldn't know I was missing anything unless they looked closely. I said proudly, "It's made to fit a throttle or a stick, so I can fly anything, anywhere. But the military won't accept me, even though I have lots of experience." The First Lady smiled and said, "Then there's someone you should talk to." In 1941, Jacqueline Cochran, or Jackie to her friends, was the best female pilot in the world. She had won the Bendix Air Race twice, set speed and altitude records, and was known as the Queen of Speed. She believed that a qualified woman pilot could do all the non-combat flying a man could do, freeing up male pilots for combat. Jackie was very beautiful and a Bendix Trophy winner, which made her famous and gave her influence with Eleanor Roosevelt. The idea of women doing non-combat flying made sense to the First Lady and would help the war effort. She supported it. Anyone who understood saw that logistics were key in war. Napoleon said it best, "An army travels on its stomach." The problem was, even though American factories were making lots of planes, they still had to be delivered. Using male pilots for that meant fewer pilots for combat. The solution was clear: use qualified women to deliver the planes. But even with a severe pilot shortage, the Army leaders resisted. The best way to motivate Jackie Cochran was to tell her she couldn't do something. So she constantly pushed Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, to create an all-woman ferry pilot group. That led to the start of the 319th Women's Air Service Pilots, known as the WASPs. The WASP mascot was a female cartoon character drawn by Disney. Her name was Fifinella, or Fifi. Pilots thought gremlins were imaginary creatures that messed with their planes. But the WASPs believed Fifi didn't play bad tricks like the male gremlins. To them, Fifi kept sand out of our gas tank and kept the engine running smoothly. Fifi helped us come home safely. However, Arnold still faced problems with the tough men in his command. These men couldn't accept women as their equals. Because of this, Arnold made the WASPs a civilian volunteer group and not a military one. This act put the brave women of the 319th in the same category as office workers at the Pentagon. The WASPs' status didn't bother Jackie or the other WASPs. They signed up to serve America and would do their best, no matter how much stress, tiredness, bad weather, or prejudice they faced. The first training class, called the Guinea Pigs, took the same oath as male flight students and followed the same rules. They marched in formation since they thought they would eventually join the Army, just like the WWII had. But the WWII did traditional women's work like being operators and secretaries. The WASPs, however, were flying fighter planes and bombers. This was seen as a man's job, so even though the WASPs' work was important, some men felt uncomfortable seeing women do it. I kid you not, Congress actually used this to deny military benefits to the WASPs. When a WASP was killed in service, her family had to pay to bring her home, or her fellow WASPs would collect money to help. Even worse, they couldn't get traditional military honors, like a flag on their coffin or a gold star in a window. Yet those brave women kept flying and sometimes even dying for America. For me, the WASPs changed my life. A week after my talk at the White House, a telegram arrived at my parents' house. It invited me to meet Jackie Cochran. After a phone call and a car ride to the Hay Adams, I found myself in a room with Cochran herself. Jackie Cochran was impressive. She could outfly you, outfight you, or charm you, depending on what was needed. Plus, she was married to the head of RKO Pictures, which made her even more like a movie star. Jackie started by asking with a smile, "So you were in the air during the attack at Pearl Harbor? What were you flying?" I replied eagerly. "A Waco UPF-7? Cochran looked nostalgic and said, "I flew its big brother in the Pulitzer air races. It's a great plane, fast and agile." I said thankfully, "It saved my life." Cochran leaned back in her plush chair, looking interested, and said, "Tell me about it." I said, "I went into a full-throttle power dive after the first pass from the enemy and then pulled a high-G recovery. Any other plane would have lost its wings." She asked, "How did you get your wound then?" I said, "I was hit on the ground while running for cover." Then I added with a sad smile, "I was never very fast on my feet." Cochran asked, "Can you still fly?" I rolled up my left sleeve to show my arm and said, "I can fly just as well as I used to. They made my prosthesis so I could use the controls or even hold the stick." Then I asked eagerly, "Do you have something I can do?" Cochran gave a serious look and said, "Do I ever?" The WASPs trained at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Many male pilots noticed all the women there and often tried to land, claiming engine problems. To stop this, Jackie banned unauthorized landings, and Avenger Field was then called Cochrane's Convent. I arrived at Sweetwater for training class 43-2. The WASPs were run by women and staffed by women. But there were never enough trainers, which is where I came in. Jackie would recruit anyone she could, even a one-armed pilot like me. I was 22 years old, and this was my first assignment, so I was very nervous. There was a chain of command like any civilian agency. Jackie was the boss. Senior instructors like me managed the training units. I did the paperwork and supervised the junior flying instructors, some of whom were men like me. There were 3 phases of flight training. First, 70 hours in Stearman Cadets and Fairchild PT-19S. Then, they moved to the Vultee Valiant for another 70 hours of basic flight training. If they passed, they did 70 hours in the North American AT-6 or the twin-engine Cessna Bobcat. All these flights needed qualified instructors, and it didn't matter if they were male or female. The training period was 27 weeks, just like for male pilots. But the women weren't taught combat flying, so there was no gunnery or formation flying. They also didn't learn evasive maneuvers like the men did. The WASPs were mostly ferry pilots. They were skilled in flying many types of planes. A WASP would check a new plane to see if it was ready to ship, then fly it to its destination. The role of the WASPs was crucial to the war, just as important as fighting itself. I won't lie, I knew my new group of trainees were women. They came in all shapes and sizes. Like other men, I noticed their looks, but it never changed how I treated them. Still, some did stand out to me. Connie Fort was one of them. On the first day, she stood in the front row, looking amused. It was clear she had flown before. She was taller than most, with a neat figure, wearing what seemed like expensive clothes. What grabbed me were her hypnotic gray eyes. I knew right away she was special. Cornelia Fort wasn't a classic beauty. She looked more smart than glamorous, with a long, handsome face. But she had awareness, strength, and intelligence that pulled me towards her. That's why I asked her to stay after dismissing the others. I said, "You've flown a lot, haven't you?" She gave me a lazy look and said, "I was an Andrews instructor like you. We were both in the air on December 7th. Wow! This woman had as many flying hours as I did. Did she know the rest of my story?" she added with a hint of disdain. "I assume you and that beautiful woman you were training have split up?" Well, that answered that. I just stood there, stunned. One of my trainees was as experienced as I was, and she knew about Ronnie. That was intimidating. She laughed and said, "Close your mouth, you'll catch flies," then added, "It doesn't matter how much experience I have. I need to get past all the stages to become a WASP, and you're going to help me." That was how I met Cornelia Fort. Connie seemed quiet and self-contained. It made her look distant. But you knew there was a lot going on in her mind. She was a force of nature and my best friend. I didn't have any romantic thoughts about her. Honestly, Connie was just the only person I truly connected with. Constance Fort was a Tennessee aristocrat and acted like it, but she could fit into any group of flyers after hours. Her sarcastic humor made her popular everywhere. Connie read a lot and was a loner like me. I understood her need for solitude. She spent extra hours in the air because it seemed to be the only time she was at peace. She was the best flyer in our group. You had to actually fly with her to see how smooth and in control she was. There were strict rules about relationships between instructors and trainees. Jackie made it clear that even a hint of improper behavior would get both kicked out. She already had enough trouble with public opinions. The last thing she needed was a scandal. So there was always a room full of trainees whenever I was with Connie. I got along well with all the trainees. They knew I wanted them to succeed, so they didn't mind me hanging out with them. Women are better than men at spotting anything improper. None thought there was anything between me and Connie other than two people with a lot in common who liked each other. A lack of romance wasn't a problem for me. After my experience with Ronnie, I was off women anyway. Connie and I were true friends, not a couple. Even so, my past with Ronnie was well known, and I felt like I had to clear the air with Connie. We were all sitting outside in the hot Texas night listening to Glenn Miller records. I had dragged an armchair outside and was enjoying a beer. That's when Connie sat in the folding chair next to me. Connie wasn't conventionally pretty, but her face had a nobility that grabbed your attention. I raised my beer in a toast and she clinked hers against mine. Then we just sat there looking at the big, star-filled Texas sky. I finally said, I was a different person back then. Connie knew what I meant. She just nodded. I added, when you're young, you think you're invincible. Then something happens that shows how small you really are. You either learn from it or stay the same. Connie nodded again. I said, I learned a lot about myself when I lost my arm. I looked at Connie and added, my time with Veronica McMartin embarrasses me. But I was only 21 and didn't know how I came across. I added, being wounded and then dumped makes you look at yourself honestly. So I made a decision. I always knew right from wrong, but I didn't always choose right. Now I see how selfish that was, and I'm a better man because of it. That I promise you. Connie had the most compelling eyes. She stared right into my soul as I finished. She held my gaze for a few seconds, nodded, and said, yep. That was all she said. But it felt like a personal thumbs up. I'll never forget it. The next day I would never forget for a different reason. Maggie Oldenburg was one of the younger WASP trainees, always cheerful. She and her instructor were practicing stall recovery in a Fairchild PT-19. The problem was Maggie was the lightest trainee, and her instructor was the heaviest man in the unit. This made the plane off balance. The plane's center of gravity was too far back, so it went into a flat spin when Maggie tried to recover from a stall. A flat spin means there is no forward speed, so the plane spins like a leaf and you can't control it. The first sign that something went wrong was the siren. I rushed out of my office to see a plume of smoke rising from the Texas prairie. In that moment, I knew something terrible had happened. Because the WASPs were civilians, there was no money to pay for Maggie's funeral. Jackie covered all the costs herself. There was a lot of crying and hugging among Maggie's WASP sisters, something you'd never see in a male training unit. But these women were tough. They didn't miss a minute of flight time, and the loss just made them stronger. Some of my trainees struggled, and 7 didn't make it. But our success rate was good compared to the male cadets training. I was proud to stand with my first graduating class as Jackie and Arnold inspected us. The WASP program was growing even though it was new. My 16 women got their silver wings and were sent to different WASP bases around the country. They took on active service missions, mostly delivering new aircraft from the manufacturer to the depot to be sent overseas. The WASPs had to get advanced training at their new bases since there was a big difference between the planes they had flown before and the ones they would be delivering. They learned to fly different types of aircraft, like Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Air Cobras. Each WASP base delivered different aircraft based on what was made in the area. For example, the Wilmington base delivered P-47 Thunderbolts, while the Romulus base delivered Air Cobras and B-24S. Most deliveries were routine, but there were always dangers like bad weather, fatigue, or human error. In the middle of 1943, we got a big order of Vultee Valiants to deliver. Most were going from Long Beach to Dallas Love Field, but 4 were coming to Sweetwater. I took a train to L.A. to oversee our BT-13 SE transport. By then, I had been promoted to Base Operations XO. Besides my instructor duties, I was in charge of new aircraft delivery. Not bad for a 23-year-old with one arm. The BT-13 Valiant was bigger than anything the WASPs had flown before. It was almost the size of a fighter, so we had to get familiar with the aircraft on our first morning in L.A. The next day, we would start the delivery flights, and I made sure my friend Connie was in my flight. We spent that night at the Breakers Hotel, close to the airport. As civilians, the WASPs paid for their own places to stay, but the hotel gave us a discount. 6 of us were sitting in the sky room at the Breakers that night. Besides Connie and me, there was Olga Rexroth, who was a full-blooded Sioux, and Hazel Ying Lee. It sounds like a colorful group, right? Jackie didn't care about your background as long as you could fly. Hazel was older than Connie and me, but looked younger because she was so small. She was an athlete when she was younger and quite the joker. If anyone needed a laugh, Hazel was the one to go to. I remember my first meeting with Hazel. I had scheduled her for an orientation flight in a Fairchild PT-19. After taking off, she was back in 15 minutes, dragging a parachute and looking pleased. I ran out and asked, "What are you doing here? I thought you were on a training flight." Hazel said, "I fell out," and kept dragging her chute to the hangar. I just stood there, amazed. That happened to me a lot with those women. Hazel had forgotten to buckle her harness before the flight and fell out at the top of the first loop. Luckily, she was still over the airfield and sitting on her parachute. She floated down safely, becoming the first WASP to bail out, even if it wasn't on purpose. Hazel's casual way of doing things made her very charming. 2 male Air Service ferry pilots were also sitting with us. They were stationed at Moffett Field, near San Francisco, and had taken the train down to help with the delivery. There was a young Jewish kid named Goldwater. He was even younger than me and very serious about his first assignment. The other guy was the complete opposite. He was arrogant, full of himself, and always chasing after women. His name was Frank Stamm. He was almost as tall as me and thought he was every woman's dream. Naturally, he was immediately drawn to Connie because Connie was beautiful. Stamma figured out that to impress Connie, he needed to talk about flying. So, he dominated the conversation with stories about the men's training program, especially formation flying. He held his hands parallel and said, "You've got to learn how to fly in tight formation to survive in combat." Connie was interested, of course. This was a flying challenge she hadn't yet faced. I tried to make her see sense. None of the WASPs are trained for that. They don't need it to do their job. I had grown a lot from the reckless person I used to be. Stammy sneered and said, "Well, they should learn if they want to play with the big boys." That was nonsense. Stammy was just a ferry pilot and had never seen combat. Yet Connie was hanging on to his every word. Stammy then asked Connie, "Why don't we take a walk down by the beach and I can tell you more about what we learn in Air Service Training School?" "Yeah, right, sure." As if that was going to happen. Connie might have been naive, but she was a WASP pilot, not someone for Stammy to hit on. I might have been overprotective. I didn't have romantic feelings for Connie, but we had a special connection. I didn't want Stammy to ruin that. The thought of him getting close to her made me angry. Maybe I did have feelings for her. More important was that what Stammy was suggesting to Connie was risky. Precision flying needed lots of training, and the WASPs weren't trained for that. WASP flying groups looked more like a flock of geese, everyone in assigned positions and spread far apart. We called our formations gaggles. Also, I knew Stammy wasn't a formation flying expert because if he was, he'd be in Europe. I had to stop everyone from getting the wrong idea. I checked my watch and said, "I want you all in your rooms. We have a mission tomorrow and it's time to sleep." Stammy laughed and said, "You and the rest of the girls can go to bed. Connie and me, we're going to stay and talk about serious flying." I should have hit him. I regretted not doing it later, but we were in a nightclub surrounded by other trainees. It didn't seem smart. Instead, I said, "I'm in charge of this mission, and I won't let any of you mess it up. We all need sleep. Now." Then I turned to Stammy and said, "That includes you, flyboy." Stamma was a coward and a blowhard and wasn't going to challenge me. I was bigger than him, and he could see in my eyes that I was ready for a fight. But he needed to get the last word. He turned to Connie and said, "We can talk more later, babe. I'll show you how the real men fly." Sadly, he meant it. All of my WASPs had flown the route so many times that it was boring. We got to Tucson for the first overnight stop since none of the WASPs were trained for night flying. The next morning, we took off from Tucson and landed in Midland, Texas by noon to refuel. In Midland, I saw Connie and Stammy talking at the snack bar. It seemed like they were planning something. I was convinced they were discussing formation flying again. I went over to remind them that close flying was forbidden during delivery flights, but Stammy was still working on Connie, and she hated backing down from a challenge. She was too stubborn for her own good. 45 minutes east of Midland and just south of Sweetwater, I noticed, to my fury, that Connie was trying formation flying. They must have planned it when we refueled. Connie was leading a left echelon, stair-step down, formation with her, Stammy, and then Goldwater. It was incredibly dangerous because they were less than 10 feet apart vertically, and Connie was the only one who looked sure of herself. Connie was flying steadily, but Stammy was struggling with the updrafts from the hot Texas prairie. Or maybe he was just bothering Connie. He kept moving closer and then backing off her left wing. This blatantly ignored my orders. I was about to shout at them over the radio when Stammy moved closer to Connie's plane again. To be safe, Stammy needed to stay 10 feet below and to the left rear of Connie. But his plane drifted. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was a stronger updraft. The air was like ocean waves. Anyway, Stame's mistake put him at the same altitude as Connie with his right wingtip just 3 feet from her fuselage. He should have moved carefully down and to his left. But as soon as he saw where he was, Stame panicked and turned sharply left. He probably expected Connie to turn right. That was what all male pilots were taught to do. The Wasps were not trained to fight because they didn't need to. So Connie stayed in her spot, and Stame's BT-13 plane hit her Valiant's left wing from behind. The front edge of Connie's wing broke off, including the tip. Without a proper wing, Connie's Valiant turned sharply to the left and crashed hard on the desert ground. In that tragic moment, Cornelia Fort became the first Wasp to die while on duty. The cockpit latches weren't opened, so Connie was probably knocked out when she crashed. She didn't try to escape. Connie was buried next to her father, who she loved very much. Her gravestone read, "Killed in the service of her country." Flying is risky, and people die in wars. That's a fact. But it's sadder to die because of a silly mistake. Connie made a bad call. She thought Stama was a good pilot, not a show-off. And I lost my best friend and who could have become a close companion because of that wrong belief. The senselessness of Connie's death hit me hard. I'm not embarrassed to say that my tears blocked my view for the rest of the flight to Sweetwater. Hazel, Olga, and I took the other 3 Valiants there safely. The remains of the 4th Valiant were 10 miles south of Merkel, Texas. Stame knew he was in trouble if I found him, but he was in the Army and I wasn't. So he ran to his superiors. That's why 3 big military police officers were waiting for me at Love Field. I spent the rest of my time at Love looking for him, but they kept him out of my reach. They practically sent me back to Sweetwater in a cage. The official inquiry blamed Stame, as expected, but the Army needed pilots, even bad ones like Stame, so he wasn't punished. I don't know what happened to him later, but I hoped it was bad. That boys will be boys attitude lasted until Arnold said anyone breaking rules would lose their benefits. It was ironic since the Wasps never got any benefits. Connie's friends had to gather money to send her body home. If you think relying on friends and family to send a fallen soldier home is shameful, well, that's how it was back then. Connie Fort's sudden death drained me completely. It took a long time for me to be useful to the Wasps or even myself again. It felt like, what's the point? People like me don't meet many others they feel close to, so I wasn't going to find a new friend easily. My arm added to the problem. A woman once told me I disgusted her. That hit my self-esteem and kept me from getting close to any woman romantically. My love life from puberty to 23 years old was a series of failures to connect. I thought Susan could be someone I could bond with. She understood me and shared my values. But she was already with someone else. As sad as it sounds, even Ronnie might have been the one. We shared interests, but she liked pork a lot. Her leaving me ended up being a good thing. Yet, it also made me distrust women. Connie was different. She was open and honest, not mysterious. But she was taken from me by someone's arrogance, leaving me empty inside. I wasn't doing the main job of the Wasps, which was ferrying, but I knew target towing was the most dangerous. The planes were old and had many problems. That's how Mabel Rawlinson died. Mabel's plane had engine trouble as she tried to return to the base. It didn't clear the pine trees and crashed, trapping her in the burning wreck. Everyone heard her screams. The inquiry found the plane was in bad shape and was given the wrong fuel. Mistakes happen in war, and life is fragile. But seriously, that was too much. The Wasps were brave and dedicated. Everyone who knew them recognized that. But they faced a lot of unfair hatred. For example, one Wasp was pulling a target for anti-aircraft gunners to shoot at. When they missed and the Wasp flew back, the leader of the gunning group muttered, "Hell, they missed the girl." That was the attitude the Wasps dealt with every day. Seeing such clear bias made me lose the usual dreams of a 23-year-old. It was only my duty to the Wasps that kept me from falling apart. Routine and predictability were my lifelines. Paperwork and flying were my only companions. I felt alone and miserable. Then, everything suddenly changed again. I saw my interactions with women as separate rooms, not a continuous line. I would leave one room and enter a completely new setup. Once I closed the door on an old relationship, it was like it never happened. Susan was just a teenage crush, easy to leave behind. Ronnie's relationship was heated but shallow. It hurt when she left, but I closed that door and moved on. Connie and I had a strong bond, but she had passed away. Now, standing in another room, I felt a vague sense of familiarity. My mind went back to the day I met the WASP class 43-6. It was another hot, sunny day in Texas. The weather there was always either blazing sun or heavy rain. We still followed strict military rules because the WASPs didn't know yet that they would stay civilians. The new trainees were lined up in something like military order. I knew I couldn't yell at these women the same way I would with male trainees, yet I tried to look tough as I walked along the line of recruits. I felt like a rock inside, showing no emotions. While walking, I caught sight of a pair of big blue eyes. Surprises don't usually happen in routine tasks, so I almost didn't react. But then, my brain fully registered those eyes and I stopped. Could it be? I turned back to the owner of those eyes, which made a stir among the other instructors. The girls called me the old man, even though I was only 23. It seemed like I was about to do something unexpected. I looked at the woman who stood there with a half smile and a concerned look. She was doing her best to stand at attention. I said, "See me after, recruit," and finished the inspection. When we were done, she came over to me. I gave her a confused but happy smile and asked, "What are you doing here?" With a playful tone, she said, "It's all your fault. You got me into flying." That took me back to a simpler time when death was just a word. Susan Lawson had been the most beautiful girl I knew. She still was. Over 2 years, she had grown into a stunning woman, but she still had her hair pulled up like dog ears. She added, "I already paid for the lessons. When my parents found out, they tried to stop me. Jack was furious about me flying with you, but I wanted to do it." She paused and said, "It was the first time I did something just for me, and I loved it." Susan gave me a meaningful look. "I did call you. After a month, when things calmed down, I called. But your parents said you had left. It sounded like you had a hard time with them." I felt sad. If I had known Susan was reachable, things might have been different. But I was impulsive back then. Hurting my parents and ending up in Hawaii on December 7th wasn't planned. But that was all in the past. I asked, "So, how did you get here?" She looked far away and said, "Patriotism." I understood. I felt the same way. It had changed me from a self-centered child into a man. For Susan, patriotism wasn't about showing off. It meant honor, duty, and service. It meant putting the greater good above personal gain and being ready to make sacrifices. Susan was perfect for the tough and dangerous role of a WASP. But still, how had she ended up here? Last time I saw her, she was homecoming queen. She seemed destined for a comfortable life in the suburbs. How did she become someone ready for the hard life of a WASP? It all started with our first flight together and the lessons she took. I asked, "How many flight hours do you have?" She hesitated and said, "I have 450 flight hours and a multi-engine rating, so the WASPs asked me to join. They need bomber pilots." I was shocked. "How did you get that rating? I didn't even have one." Susan looked a bit embarrassed. "Mr. Northanger, an executive at American Airlines, helped me. His son was on our soccer team. Once I got my license and my dad saw I was serious, he introduced me to Mr. Northanger." I motioned for her to continue. She sighed, like explaining to a child, "After the war began, the military took most of American Airlines' male pilots. They needed pilots badly, so Mr. Northanger got me a job as a flight engineer on their DC-3S. Then, in mid-42, their staff shortage got worse. With my commercial flying experience and ATP certificate, they made me a co-pilot on regular flights." I could hardly believe it. Susan, flying a twin-engine passenger plane as a commercial pilot, was mind-blowing. She was my teenage crush, the popular girl at school, admired by everyone, who everyone assumed would marry Jack Lambertson, did that. The war had changed a lot of things for women. I finally asked the only question I really cared about. "So what happened to Jack?" Susan frowned and said, "He's in the past. When Pearl Harbor happened, Jack's dad got him a job as a congressional aide, so he got a draft exemption like most rich kids did." Susan kept talking. "And he quickly wanted to make me his pretty wife, but I couldn't see myself just going to fancy parties and baking cookies while a war was happening." I felt relieved. The Susan telling this story was the Susan I knew and loved. Susan laughed. "It didn't end well for either of us. One night he got drunk and tried to break into my house. He thought he could take me, but I had him arrested. Then I was shunned by polite society because I pressed charges. You know how Georgetown is." Susan mimicked an old woman's voice. "Proper young women don't press charges just because a man assaults them. It's so scandalous." Susan looked annoyed and said, "So I moved to Chicago, where the American DC-3 passenger service starts from, and joined the WASPs when they recruited me." There it was. Susan had followed the path from student to licensed pilot, got her specialty, and flew enough hours to be considered. It was also no surprise that we would meet again. All the WASPs went through the same training, no matter how experienced, so Susan and I were bound to meet again as soon as she signed the contract. Now, my first and only true love was standing in front of me, looking like she expected me to say something. That made me very uncomfortable, because I could hear my superior's voice telling me that fraternization was forbidden, even in situations like ours. I said, "I can only tell you this once. You know the rules about fraternization, and I don't want either of us kicked out of the WASPs. But I have never forgotten you, and if things were different, I would ask you to be my girl right now." I added with hope, "I promise we have a future once the war is over. But for now, you are the trainee, and I am your XO. Can you live with that?" Susan's face lit up. It was like this was exactly what she wanted to hear. She said, "You will never have a reason to doubt me as a trainee or as your friend." I added sadly, "Before you promise anything, though, there's something you need to know about me." I had to do it even though I knew it might end things. I rolled up my left sleeve and Susan gasped at what she saw. I unstrapped the fake arm and slipped the sleeve off my stump, revealing my amputated arm. Susan got teary and began to cry. I hadn't expected that. Still, it told me all I needed to know. She was disgusted by the arm. Of course she was. Who wouldn't be? I looked around, worried, hoping nobody saw us. Susan's reaction was odd for two supposed strangers, and it could get us in trouble. I was just about to give up all my hopes when Susan said, "Oh, Erik, that's heartbreaking. How did it happen? Does it hurt?" I said, embarrassed. "I was hurt in the first 15 minutes of the war. A shell took off my left arm. I know how gross it looks, and I understand how you feel. I know I'm repulsive to women." Susan looked shocked. She said, "I can't believe you said that. You are so much more than one missing arm. You are tall, handsome, and my guy, that is, if you'll have me." "Was that a choir of angels?" I said, heartfelt. "You're beautiful, capable, and strong. Any man would want you. I can't believe you have feelings for me, but I promise if you accept me, even though I'm damaged, you will have my total devotion, even if I'm missing some parts." A reunion on the tarmac of a busy airport was a strange way for Susan Lawson and me to come back together. But the war had made us grown-ups, and our bond was real. WASP Class 43, 6 went on the usual track. There were fewer failures since it was harder to become a WASP. Susan and I had the same relationship I had with Connie, meaning non-romantic. We hung out with the other WASP trainees, and nobody saw anything but a trainer-recruit relationship. But this time, there were deeper feelings. There is a difference between deep friendship and love. Both involve respect and thinking about the other's feelings. Love adds the desire to be physically close, and both Susan and I wanted more than friendship. Even so, any romantic relationship we could have had to be put aside. Susan was ethical and wanted to be a WASP. I saw my duties with the WASPs as a sacred trust, more than any personal desire. Neither of us wanted to lose that. Still, it didn't stop us from small expressions of affection that lovers have, and it was definitely love at that point. Every guy knows a woman like Susan. She's the one all the other guys want to date and the one all the girls want to be. But being the most popular girl in high school is more about looks than who you really are. I had only known the teenage beauty. I saw the true person at last, and she was wonderful. Because of Susan's time flying the DC-3, she was in a special group training to fly bombers. Bomber pilots needed to learn how to control planes using electric motors, gears, and hydraulics. So instead of flying our AT-6 Texans, Susan always flew our twin-engine Cessna AT-8 Bobcat. The Bobcat could hold up to 3 extra people. This meant several trainees could fly together and take turns. Seeing 4 women walk confidently across the runway, all wearing leather A4 jackets with a Fifanella patch on their left chest and their parachutes over their shoulders, chatting and laughing, showed the true spirit and friendship of the WASPs. But these brave women all knew the dangers. This made me finally tell Susan that I loved her. What pushed me was a telegram I received, saying Hazel Ying Lee had died the night before. Hazel was in Detroit, delivering P-39 Air Cobras and P-63 King Cobras from the Bell factory in Niagara Falls, New York. These planes went to Great Falls, Montana, where they were sent to the Russians. The Russians liked the P-63 because its 37mm cannon was great at destroying tanks. Russian pilots would take them from Great Falls to Russia through Alaska. U.S. pilots, however, were glad to see them go, thinking, good riddance. Hazel had delivered King Cobras many times, but a snowstorm at Great Falls caused confusion in the tower. Hazel was cleared to land at the same time as another P-63, causing a collision that took her life. I read the telegram from Jackie while Susan and I were at a party for her class's graduation. Even though Susan and I sat close together, the other girls didn't mind. They guessed what was going on, but there was nothing to see. I hadn't shown any favoritism. Susan was a great pilot who took flying seriously. After reading the telegram, I covered my face to hide my tears. Susan, worried, asked, "Erik, what's wrong?" I kept my head down, not wanting her to see me cry, and said, "We lost another WASP last night. Hazel was a joker sometimes, but she was a good pilot and a great friend." Susan responded, "Oh, Erik, I'm so sorry, but she died serving her country, which is very noble." I said, "It's not Hazel's death that upsets me. You're going to face the same danger soon, and I can't bear losing you." I hesitated, feeling this was a reckless thing to say, and continued, "I love you, Susan Lawson." She gasped and seemed to melt into me. Then, hugging me, she whispered, "I love you too, Erik. I've loved you for a long time." That was it, just a quiet embrace. We quickly moved apart before anyone noticed and returned to the conversation around our little fire. But we knew we had made a lifetime promise. I was flying less because I had to manage the operation. But Susan's instructors were so impressed that they suggested I send her to the WASP's Wilmington base. This base delivered the B-26 Marauder, a tough plane to land which had caused many crashes. The B-26 was known as the Widowmaker because of its powerful engines and small wings, which meant you had to land it at a high speed to avoid stalling. I was worried about sending Susan to Wilmington because I had lost one soulmate already, and the B-26 was dangerous. When I told Susan my concern, she got very mad. She said, "I didn't join the WASPs for you to protect me. Flying freed me from my parents, and serving my country makes me who I am, an independent woman. You won't take that away from me by keeping me safe here." I understood. Susan had worked hard against expectations to become who she was. If I truly loved her, I had to let her face danger. That's the thing about honor and duty. They're not convenient and can be heartbreaking. So I felt deep despair as I watched Susan leave in one of our Bobcats. 2 other WASPs from her class, Dorothea Johnson and Dee Dee Mormon, went with her. They flew to the Newcastle Army Air Base at Wilmington, and Jackie would fly the Bobcat back to Sweetwater. This was surprising and made me uneasy because Jackie was coming to Sweetwater specifically to talk to me. I waited nervously on the tarmac as the Bobcat arrived. Jackie, looking bright and cheerful, hopped down from the plane. I thought, oh, she wants something. We had a ready room. It had a big coffee pot on a hot plate. Without saying anything, Jackie motioned me into the room, grabbed a cup of black coffee, and said, "Sit down, Erik." I followed her to a couple of old wing chairs in the far corner. It was where most of us went for a short nap. It gave a bit of privacy. Jackie took a sip of her boiling hot coffee and looked really happy. It seemed like she couldn't feel pain. Then she gave me a commanding look, the kind that made you do exactly what she wanted. I waited, nervous, as Jackie said, "The WASPs were promised military status and benefits. It's time for this country to keep that promise. I've told Hap Arnold that he either brings the WASPs into the military or I'm going to shut down the entire program." I gasped. "Shut down the WASPs?" Jackie, showing her determination, said, "The WWIIs and Waves have been part of the U.S. military since early 1942. None of them have been killed in action. But we have lost over 30 WASPs in active service, and they haven't gotten the military status and benefits their sisters have." I hadn't thought about that before, and it made me very angry. I shouted, "That's a disgrace to our nation. We must do whatever it takes to get military benefits for the WASPs." Yes, I know. I had just walked into a trap. I wasn't sharp when it came to being tricked. Jackie pounced. She said, "The House of Representatives is working on a bill to make the WASP a military organization like the WWIIs, Waves, and SPARs." I said cautiously, "That's nice. But why are you talking to me?" This seemed very suspicious. Jackie smiled, a smile you couldn't refuse, and said, "You know many people in the government thanks to your dad's job at the Treasury, and you've been with the WASP since the start. You're a well-known WASP instructor and administrator, so I'm going to assign you to Hap Arnold as an official go-between for the WASPs." Jackie continued, "You will need the right status to deal with all the big egos in Washington, so I'm making you my chief of staff. You'll be in charge of WASP operations and act as my go-between with the AAF and Congress." Jackie added, "This would do two important things. First, it would bring justice to the WASPs. Second, it would put someone I trust close to Arnold. Arnold wants a woman colonel to head the military WASPs. Who would be better for that job than me?" Jackie was smart and ambitious. She knew that having me next to Arnold would help her chances to get that job. But DC politics is dangerous. If I wasn't careful, I could get badly hurt. Why would I take on such a big challenge? Maybe because I would be just 2 hours away from Susan instead of 2 days away in Sweetwater. Susan's leaving hit me much harder than Connie's loss. I was desperate to be close to her. Jackie was still talking. She said, "I know I can make this work with Hap if you promise to manage both jobs." She meant doing her paperwork and pushing her agenda in Congress. For me, being near Susan was worth any risk of working for Jackie, so I said gratefully, "I won't let you down." Jackie gave me a big smile and added, "And say hello to your friend Susan Lawson for me. I heard she's delivering planes in Wilmington now." That woman never missed a thing. In D.C., nothing happens without someone getting something in return. And now, I was Jackie's man, bought with the promise of being close to Susan. Jackie must have loved it when a plan came together. The next week, I was sitting in the office of Lieutenant General Hap Arnold in the newly built Pentagon across the Potomac in Alexandria. Hap was a leader in aviation. He had the 29th pilot license and was the second American military pilot only because he lost a coin toss. He was a protege of Billy Mitchell and the right guy to lead the Army Air Force in World War II. So there I was, dressed in my best WASP uniform as I was shown into Arnold's office in the E-Ring. I had bought the outfit myself because there was no uniform allowance for the WASPs, but my parents had money and they were proud of me. I looked like a real military aviation officer, even though I was actually part of a civilian volunteer group, mostly made up of women. By December 1943, the WASPs wore a Santiago blue wool uniform with a gold WASP pin and a small pair of winged propellers on each collar. The silver pilot's wings with a central shield were worn on the left chest. The shield looked like the one carried by Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom and war. The AAF patch was on the shoulder. There was no rank badge because we were civilians. I wore the uniform with pride because I knew those women were making a huge contribution to the war effort. The truth is, by that point in the war, 1,074 WASP pilots had flown 60 million miles and delivered 13,000 aircraft. This allowed 900 male pilots to go overseas for combat duty. If you're keeping count, that's like having 38 full squads of pilots or 13 combat wings. This was almost the same as the manpower of the entire 8th and 9th Air Forces combined. Since those two forces bombed Hitler heavily, the WASP's contribution was very important. It made a big difference. I knew that Arnold was one of the few high-ranking officers who believed that the only thing that mattered was if you could do the job. Eisenhower and MacArthur thought the same way. But that kind of thinking took a wide view of the world. Most people in the Pentagon, however, had prejudices about women in the military. It was similar to how they felt about race in small towns in Mississippi. Arnold was known for being friendly, which is why he had that nickname, but he greeted me with a harsh, "Sit down." So I sat. He looked at me with dislike. I didn't understand why until I realized that my WASP uniform made him think I was one of those rich kids who avoided the draft and liked pretending to be a hero. So I politely asked, "May I take off my coat?" Hap made a go-ahead gesture and kept glaring at me. Once my coat was off, I rolled up the sleeve of my left arm past my elbow. Arnold's eyes popped out, and he changed his attitude completely. Curiously, he asked, "Where did you lose the arm?" I replied, "I was probably the first flyer injured in the attack on Pearl Harbor. I was in the air when the Japanese showed up. They got me on the ground after I landed." Arnold asked, "Were you with the 15th or 18th Pursuit?" "Those were the fighter groups at Pearl Harbor." I said neither. I was a civilian teacher. My student made it to the hangar, but they shot me just before I got to safety. I added, "Jackie gave me a job with the WASPs. They didn't mind a one-armed pilot. I was the deputy at Sweetwater. But because Jackie wants the WASP military bill passed, and I know many people here in D.C., she thought I might be useful as an advisor to you." Arnold said, "I like your attitude, kid. What are you, 28, 29? I proudly replied, 24, almost 25. Arnold laughed and said, "We need all the young energy we can get. That is, if we want to do right by your WASPs. There's a lot of opposition to the WASPs among the male pilots, and John Costello is having a hard time getting support for his bill." That was a smart observation. But then again, you have to be both a politician and a strong leader to get to Arnold's level. I said, "Most of the opposition is due to ignorance. So one thing I can do is talk to people about the WASP program from my own experience and explain all the benefits they provide." I added eagerly, "Jackie has based me here in D.C. now, so as soon as you allow me, I'm ready to start speaking for the WASPs on Capitol Hill." And that's how I became a sort of lobbyist for the WASPs. The war went on into 1944, and a few more brave women died doing their duty. The WASPs were almost fully responsible for delivering the high-performance planes going overseas, which increased the chances of fatal accidents. But the WASPs kept going despite mechanical failures and bad weather. It wasn't just the new WASPs who died during that time. The loss of Evelyn Sharp affected me the most because she was one of the originals and a friend of both Connie and me. Evelyn was also one of the best pilots in the country, male or female. But one day, an engine of the twin-engine P-38 Lightning she was delivering failed right after takeoff. With almost any other pilot, the force from the still-running engine would have flipped the Lightning over. But Evelyn skillfully pushed the rudders hard to counter the loss of the engine and turned the plane back to the field, where she landed it with the wheels up. The plane wasn't badly damaged, but Evelyn's neck was broken by the impact. The crash truck guys said it looked like she was sleeping. Evelyn died in early April 1944 while I was trying to win the support of a bunch of middle-aged men who had never risked their lives. They say that power corrupts. If you have it, you want to keep it, and the only way to do that is by making your supporters happy. And we are talking about the lowest common level here, not the best and brightest. The WASPs were a big issue in American society because of powerful male pilots. Plus, the American voters didn't like the idea of strong, independent women. So most members of the House of Representatives saw no reason to support the WASPs. They could see that the WASPs cost money, which was right in the budget. But the real impact of losing them was too hard for the average congressman to understand. Shutting down the WASPs would mean the Air Force had to train almost 800 new ferry pilots at 3 times the cost of the current WASP budget. More importantly, the WASPs already had 2 years of experience that couldn't be replaced. This training gap would stop the delivery of new planes for 6 months while the male pilots were trained. Then the delivery process had to start from scratch, even though the WASP pilots had the needed experience. To make things worse, the program's legitimacy was under fire. Headlines like, "Not created by Congress," popped up in newspapers across the country. Of course, the military would be ineffective if every unit had to be approved by lawmakers. But that didn't matter to a politician trying to get re-elected in small-town America. All I could do was try to explain the benefits of the WASP program to each congressman, hoping the bill to make the WASPs part of the military would pass in the House. I worked on it day and night, mostly at night because that's when you take important people out for pricey dinners. Despite our hard work, the bill H.R. 4219 was defeated by 19 votes on June 21, 1944, and the outcome was clear. Congress had approved funding for the next year, but Jackie and Arnold decided to close the program right away. For Jackie, it was either full military status or nothing. Too many brave women had already died hoping for recognition. Now that this promise was broken, Jackie couldn't ask her WASPs to risk their lives anymore. Jackie's WASPs would have done it willingly because that's who they were. But sometimes a leader has to make decisions for the good of everyone. Jackie did the right thing, what anyone with a heart would have done. As for me, I felt more disillusioned. The only reason I had put up with all this was to be close to Susan. She was thrilled I was nearby. I hadn't seen her since she left Sweetwater. We wrote to each other, sharing as much detail as we could despite the censors. But I was busy with lobbying in D.C., so we hadn't met up yet. When the vote result came in, I told Jackie I was taking some time off to visit a friend. We were officially a civilian agency now, and government workers get vacations. I didn't even call Susan. I just hopped in my Ford, the one we had our first date in, and drove the 2 hours to Newcastle Air Base. Newcastle was 7 miles south of Wilmington on the Delaware River. It was a bright, sunny day. I had the top down and Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing playing on the radio as I drove up to the base entrance. The guard was going to give me a hard time until I showed him my ID, signed by Hap Arnold himself. That changed his mind. I asked, "Where is the WASP base?" He pointed to a cinder-block building across the runway. I drove there and walked into the busy operations center. By then, the Newcastle WASPs were also doing target towing along with deliveries. The big board with all the assignments was full of familiar names. Dee Dee Mormon was standing near the door, smoking, and she gave me a nervous glance. I asked, "Where's Susan?" Her glance became even more uneasy. I asked, "Is she on a delivery?" Dee Dee looked cautious and said, "She's out to lunch right now. She should be back in 45 minutes. I said, "I'll wait," and sat down. Dee Dee seemed really nervous. She said, "Susan's with somebody. I can't tell you who." Old feelings of insecurity swirled inside me, but I stayed calm and said, "That's nice." Inside, my mind was shouting, "I just knew it." This always seemed to happen to me. Dee Dee avoided more conversation until the door opened. Susan Lawson walked in, looking stunning. She was followed by a good-looking man who had clearly seen combat. Susan was laughing at something he said, and my jealousy flared. Dee Dee stopped her at the door. They whispered for a moment. My heart sank. Susan turned, saw me, and her face lit up with joy, which was surprising. Susan rushed over and hugged me. That eased my jealousy a bit. Maybe the big secret was military. Susan didn't introduce her companion right away. Instead, he walked over and stood there while Susan kissed me warmly. Susan finally pulled back and said, smiling, "This is Colonel Paul Tibbets. He just made me an offer I can't turn down." I hoped it wasn't a marriage proposal. Anyone who has read history knows who Paul Tibbets is now. But back then, he was just a famous war hero. He offered me his hand, and I shook it. But I sensed there was something I needed to know. I'm not the type to let suspicion grow. So I turned to Susan and said, "Spill it. I know something's up. Tell me what it is." Susan looked at Tibbets, and he nodded with a smile. Susan beamed and said, "Colonel Tibbets just asked Dee Dee and me to fly the B-29. I had no idea what a B-29 was, so I said, trying not to sound annoyed, "I can tell from the B that it's a bomber, but I've never seen or heard about one by that name." Tibbets stepped in and said, "The B-29's development has been kept top secret because it's going to win the war. We finished testing last year, and Boeing is now making more of them to get enough ready for combat." He stopped and added, "I'm in charge of that program, and I wanted a couple of WASPs to deliver the first one. It's going to get a lot of media attention. It will be a ceremonial flight from the base at Eglin to White Sands, and these two," he nodded towards Susan and Dee Dee, "were chosen from all the Marauder pilots." Oh, what an honor. The love of my life, the girl I gave her first plane ride to, was going to fly a big 4-engine bomber without any training. That was truly a great achievement, and I was proud of her. But I had been around the aviation business long enough to know Tibbets was not telling the whole truth. Still, Tibbets was the only one in the room who knew what he was not sharing. The part that Tibbets didn't tell us was that Several factors, including the B-29's advanced design, tough performance needs, and the huge push to get it into use, had created a plane no sane pilot wanted to fly. Less than a year earlier, the prototype even killed Boeing's chief test pilot, Edmund Allen. The problem was with the engines. They often caught fire at bad times, killing the crew. Fixing that issue took most of late 1943 and early 1944. Boeing thought it had fixed the fire problem by replacing the weak Wright Cyclone engines with Pratt & Whitney R 4360S, and major fixes were happening for the 15 B-29S they had. Now someone had to prove the fix worked. That's what Tibbets had in mind for Susan and Dee Dee. It was a cold and cynical move. The people in charge figured the best way to make male bomber crews accept the new plane was to shame them by having a couple of wasps deliver it. See how easy and safe it is. Even a woman can do it. You get the idea. Of course, not telling the women that the plane had a long record of deadly crashes, Allen's plane had even damaged part of Seattle, might be a bit heartless. But I guessed Susan would have volunteered anyway. It would have been over my dead body. But Susan believed the Tree of Liberty sometimes needed the sacrifice of patriots. Tibbets solved that moral problem by not telling me or Susan that the real goal of the flight was to prove the B-29 was safe. He also didn't train Susan or Dee Dee on important facts, like the need to quickly increase speed after takeoff to avoid engine problems. But Tibbets wanted to make sure the plan worked. He knew if two women who weren't trained could fly a B-29, then any male pilot who refused would look bad. It was a clever trick. The woman I wanted to be with might be put at risk for the military's plans, but America was going to drop the A-bomb, and only the superfortress could do it. So we all had to do what was needed to make that happen. Luckily, neither of us knew any of that. Susan thought it was a special delivery flight, and I was so focused on our relationship that I wasn't thinking about anything else. I knew the WASP program would end soon, and Susan wasn't a trainee anymore. So our relationship wasn't against the rules. More importantly, Jackie approved of us being together, so it was time to talk about our future. The B-29 delivery was set for 3 weeks from that day, and Susan didn't need to be at Eglin until the following week. I had told Jackie I wasn't coming back until Monday, and the June weather was great, so I booked us a weekend room at the inn at Montchanin, a historic hotel 10 miles northwest of the base. The Montchanin is kept up by A.I. Dupont de Nemours and Company, known to most people as just DuPont. Needless to say, there's money around. So the place had everything I wanted, luxurious, quiet, and private. I was making more money than I ever imagined. Therefore, I could afford to splurge. At that point, I had known Susan for 4 years. Was it only 4 years? It felt like forever. During that time, we had held hands and shared 3 modest kisses. That was our love life. But that was about to change. I was no longer Susan's trainer, and the WASP program was ending. So it was time to add the last part to our committed relationship, being close physically. And it was as much Susan's idea as it was mine. Susan was still wearing her flight overalls, which the WASPs called zoot suits, as I opened the door to our nice room. The fact that Susan was still dressed for flying showed how eager we were when we left the base. As soon as I closed the door, Susan got a playful look and slowly unzipped her overalls, letting them fall to the floor. She was left standing in her bra and panties. Her round, well-shaped body and her long legs were shown to me for the first time. Her body looked like it was sculpted. She smiled warmly and asked, "Do you like it?" I remembered what I said the first time she asked me that. "God, yes," I replied. But this time I knew what was coming next. I hurriedly took off my uniform pants, shirt, and shoes. The only thing left was the thing I feared most, my artificial arm. The prosthetic arm looked strange by itself. Now, Susan was going to see and touch the stump. I undid the straps and, with hesitation, slipped off the leather sleeve, revealing my amputation. The surgeon had folded strips of skin over, making it look like the end of a sausage. After 3 years, my skin looked normal, but there were clear scars where the skin grafts joined. I looked at Susan with pleading eyes, hoping she wouldn't be too shocked by my deformity. But she looked at my amputated arm with nothing but love and care. Then she took my left arm and gently kissed the end of it. Lying back, she said, with more emotion than her words suggested, "I know your wound matters to you, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." She laughed happily and said, "You are kind, caring, a great pilot, and a wonderful man. Let's get to what we came here for. I can't wait any longer." Her kind and loving gesture brought tears to my eyes as I lay down beside her. I took a moment to take in her beautiful body. Susan's perfect shape struck me. Her neck was graceful yet strong, and her shoulders were broad but still delicate. Her boobs were full but perfectly proportional to her body. Her stomach was flat, and her hips were wide, but you could see the muscle definition. Susan's legs were truly amazing, long, smooth, and strong, with muscles clearly defined. Her lower legs were a bit longer than average, making her look almost like a graceful young horse. The beauty ended in a dainty pair of feet with bright red toenails. I looked at Susan's face, which was glowing with affection. I said simply and sincerely, "I love you." She whispered, "I love you too." Then our lips met for our first serious kiss. Susan's mouth opened to welcome my exploring tongue, and we were lost in each other for what felt like hours. Susan and I parted ways on Monday morning. She was flying one of our AT-6S down to Eglin, and I caught a C-47 from Andrews all the way to Alamogordo in New Mexico. The flight from D.C. to Holloman AFB there took almost a day. For months, there had been a lot of traffic between D.C. and that area, which was mostly desert and rattlesnakes. I found out later it was because of the Manhattan Project. For me, catching a ride on a C-47 was just an easy way to get where I needed to be. I had to play a role that Jackie planned for me. I was representing the WASPs, and it felt like their last big moment. I dressed the part of WASP Chief of Staff in my best Santiago blue uniform. Jackie said I was her stand-in, so I was treated like an important person. Jackie knew what Susan's real job was. She wanted to make male pilots accept the B-29. It was a chance to show how much WASPs had helped in the war. Jackie also knew it was possible Susan and Dee Dee might not make it. But Jackie, who raced against top male pilots, was willing to take that risk. My job was to make sure everyone, especially the press, knew 2 WASPs were flying the plane. This was to be the most visible proof of their help during the war. I wanted everyone who argued against the WASPs to see what they were losing. It was a hot day in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, 110 degrees and not a cloud in the sky. The landscape was empty, and there were mountains far away. I regretted wearing my wool uniform, but I was there to guide the WASPs when they arrived. If they didn't, their flight record would be hidden for 50 years. Holloman supports the White Sands testing range and Alamogordo, so it had a big airport even in the desert. The runways were long and the facilities were fancy. I was in the VIP area with VIP seats for the congressmen and Air Force top people. These were the folks there to get attention and suffer in the heat. The press roamed outside the VIP area like curious birds. I needed to make sure America knew 2 WASPs were flying the plane. I went to the edge of the area, and reporters crowded around me like pigeons in a park when a lady feeds them. The B-29 was a secret because the Air Force thought it was key to the bombing campaign. It was much bigger than the B-17, with a longer body and wider wings. This gave the B-29 3 times the range of a B-17. But more importantly, the B-29 could carry 10 tons of bombs, while the B-17 only carried 2.5 tons. This was crucial because our atomic bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, weighed 5 tons each. People were unsure about the B-29 because its engines could catch fire. Susan's flight aimed to settle those doubts, even if the doubts were mostly true. True or not, I only cared that Susan and Dee Dee's arrival would prove WASPs could do the job, even if male pilots wouldn't. I couldn't tell the reporters the real reason for this big show. Instead, I used my quick interview to praise the brave women. I didn't mention that their efforts would end in 6 months. Telling that bad news to the press was like a crime, at least to the high-ranking Air Force people at the event. Susan was supposed to arrive at 11 o'clock Alamogordo time. It got closer to 11:30, and there was no Susan. We couldn't track the flight, but we could hear the ATC chatter on loudspeakers set up everywhere. Time dragged on. Then I heard Susan's voice crackle over the radio asking for landing clearance. I didn't know I could hold my breath that long. I had 2 thoughts. She made it, and the image of her focused face from 4 years ago. It felt like a long time had passed. Then a shiny silver plane appeared in the distance. If the B-17 was an eagle, then the B-29 looked like a giant condor. It was the biggest plane I had ever seen, shining in the hot New Mexico sun. Susan was at 2,000 feet, flying the B-29 past the crowd and turning over the desert. I could hear her calm voice on the radio, showing she was in control. The B-29 looked different than I imagined, more like a spaceship than a plane. It was huge, with a round nose and no big cockpit, just a long metal tube with a glass front. Susan had a clear view of the runway as she approached landing. The wheels came down and I saw the B-29 had modern landing gear. A puff of blue smoke showed as the tires hit the runway and the plane slowed down. I saw the big Fifanella art on the nose, showing the Wasps had arrived. I could see Susan and Dee Dee in the glass cockpit as they parked. They were professionals, not celebrating but treating it like a normal day at work. The Wasps had done what no one else would do, and it was time for them to get the recognition they deserved. The 10 men in the crew, mostly enlisted guys, got out of the plane first using different exits. The 2 Wasps were the stars, so they came out last to loud cheers from the crowd of important people and reporters. Army PR had them stand in front of the plane, Fifanella, for photos. It was a humbling moment. 8 big men with 2 small women in the middle. One of them the love of my life. An Air Force PR guy tried to take the 2 Wasps to meet the officers. That's when I stepped in. I said, "Get lost, buddy. This is a Wasp operation, not yours." Susan looked surprised and said, "I didn't know you would be here." We didn't hug or kiss. We both stayed professional. I said with a smile, "I was on your first flight. Do you think I'd miss your big moment?" The PR guy noticed my Wasp uniform and sneered, "Go back and play with the rest of the girls." Colonel Tibbets, who was on the flight, saw what was coming. He stepped in before I could throw a punch. He said, "Stand down, Lieutenant. These women are Wasps." Tibbets was smart. He knew a fight would ruin things for everyone. The rest of the day went as Tibbets planned. Susan and Dee Dee gave a talk to the male pilots. Susan was beautiful and a great pilot, so you can imagine how well it went. I stayed on the edges to make sure the 2 women got the respect they deserved. Some called me that Wasp guard. If it fits, it fits. Susan and Dee Dee spent a couple of weeks at Holloman flying Fifanella with different crews. They got a lot of praise for their skills. Then the top brass found out 2 women were flying the B-29 prototype and almost had a meltdown. One high-ranking officer even said, "Those women are making the big football players look bad." Jackie and I spent the last 5 months of the WASP program wrapping things up. The final day was December 20th, 1944, when the last class of WASP trainees graduated. They got their silver wings but would never serve in the military. But there was one last part to our story. It involved a very unique woman, Gertrude Tommy Tompkins. When she was young, Tommy had a bad stutter and was very shy. Her wealthy parents sent her to live on a family farm, hoping it would help. Instead, she just grew to love goats. Tommy might have lived a quiet life if it weren't for an American pilot. By her mid-20s, Tommy was beautiful, slim, and dark-haired. Even with her stutter, a pilot swept her off her feet. But he died flying with the RAF in Europe, and Tommy joined the Wasps. At Sweetwater, Tommy stayed to herself because of her stutter. But she was such a good pilot, she got into advanced pursuit school, which was like the Top Gun of that time. She learned to fly the P-38 Lightning and the P-51 Mustang. Amazingly, after her first P-51 flight, Tommy's stutter disappeared. Maybe she gained the confidence from flying America's best fighter plane. Freed from her stutter, Tommy found love again. She married Army Technical Sergeant Henry Silver. The marriage was strange and raised questions later on. Silver had known Tommy for years before they married, and most people thought Tommy was still mourning her first love. But suddenly they got married. Then, Tommy returned to duty without her wedding ring or using her married name. WASP rules frowned on marriage, so Tommy might have feared losing her job. Her secret marriage and odd behavior later added to the mystery of her disappearance. I got involved with Tommy on Halloween 1944. I was at the Pentagon talking to General Arnold about shutting down the WASP program when he got an urgent phone call. It had to be serious. Arnold listened and then handed me the phone. It was Jackie. She sounded frantic and said, "I need you in Los Angeles now. We have a problem." I was confused and asked, "What?" She said, "Just get to Mines Field ASAP," and hung up. Arnold shrugged, as puzzled as I was, and said, "I'll get you on the next flight." 12 hours later, tired and rumpled, I was talking to an upset officer at Mines. On Thursday, October 26th, 40 WASPs were at Mines Field to fly P-51Ds to Newark, New Jersey. They planned to stop in Tucson that night since WASPs couldn't fly after dark. If they didn't leave by 3:18 p.m., they'd have to stay in Palm Springs. That timing was crucial to figuring out what happened to Tommy. Tommy had to stop her takeoff and move to the side of the runway because of a bent door. The P-51D plane she flew had a clear top cover, so the problem was likely with the latch that held it shut. The mechanics worked on the plane a bit, and then the inspectors cleared it. But it was too late to make the 3:18 deadline. So Tommy told the mechanics she would stay overnight in Palm Springs. That caused some confusion. 2 days passed before anyone realized that Tommy had not shown up anywhere. She had vanished completely, and that's why I was in LA, trying to figure out what the heck had happened. Everyone had their own ideas. The most believable thought was that the latch problem came back as Tommy was taking off. The P-51D was a tough plane to fly, and if the cover suddenly opened in bad weather, it could have distracted Tommy enough to crash into Santa Monica Bay. Someone said they saw something like that happen. Another idea was that Tommy decided to start a new life and disappeared. Or maybe she chose to end her life. But suicide was ruled out because Tommy had everything going for her. So maybe she just wanted a fresh start without her new husband and her speech problems. No one really knows. What we do know is that Tommy Tompkins is the only woman declared missing in action during World War II. For me, the mystery of Tommy Tompkins didn't last long. That's because 3 days after I got to Los Angeles, my world fell apart. It was the disaster I always feared, and it took over my life. After delivering the B-29 plane, Susan was in high demand as a test pilot. So, she was sent to the Flight Test Division at Wright-Patterson Air Base. My love was testing the new P-59A jet plane while I dealt with our Tommy problem. And no, you don't have to remind me whose job was more exciting. Test pilots get the glory because every day could be their last. I didn't want to think about that, but the risk was always there. The P-59 era Comet was a bad plane. It was like a King Cobra plane, but with 2 British jet engines on the side. The heat of the engines often caused problems, making the plane's engine stop in mid-air. Even in practice fights, the era Comet lost to older piston engine planes like the P-47S and P-38S. But the government bought them anyway. Why? Not for combat, but to show that the U.S. had jet fighters too, since Germany had the Me-262. It made the Air Force look better. So we bought 100 just for appearances. They were trying to give the impression that we had some kind of jet fighter, even though it wasn't very good. Each era Comet was tested before it was accepted, and the WASPs were the best at these tests. The testing was done at Wright Field in Dayton, and that's what Susan was doing one gray day in Ohio. Susan was landing era Comet 44, 22620 when both engines failed. She was flying what was basically a brick. Observers said she did a great job trying to glide it to the runway, but she fell short by about 100 yards. The plane crashed, skidded, hit a fence, and then plunged into a deep ditch. I first heard about the crash from Jackie. She said, "There's been a situation with Susan." In WASP code, situation means a plane crash. Anyone who has lost someone close knows what happened next. My vision blurred, adrenaline rushed through my body, and my heart raced. The voice in my head screamed, "No, this can't be happening!" My eyes were already wet with tears. Jackie waited. She had been through this many times. She finally said, "I've arranged for Flo Watson to fly you to Wright Pat. She's at Mines on a delivery and is waiting for you at the North American hangar." That was Jackie being kind. She knew how I felt about Susan, and the WASPs were delivering the 2-seater version of the P-51D, so I could ride to Dayton. Susan survived the crash but was in very bad shape. Her life was hanging by a thread. I got to the hospital after a record-fast flight. Florine flew fast because she saw how much pain I was in. When I got to the nurse's station, I must have looked like I had escaped from a mental ward. I was frantic and messy. They might have stopped me since I wasn't family. But I was chief of staff for the WASPs, and Susan was a WASP. So I used that to get in. I was only 25, just a kid, really. But I had already seen too much sorrow from losing friends in service. People who mattered to me, Connie, Hazel, and Evelyn, were alive one day, then gone the next. You can't understand how that feels unless you've been there. Losing my friends hurt deeply, but it was nothing compared to how I felt seeing Susan, my brave lover, lying still on white hospital sheets. She had paid the price for her service. I hoped it wasn't the ultimate price. An old, experienced nurse led me back to Susan's room. She had seen everything and gave off a feeling of kindness. She was just the sort of woman I wanted taking care of my love. Susan's lovely face looked calm, her big, smart eyes shut. She was breathing lightly, but at least she was still alive. She had hurt her head, which was why she was unconscious, but the doctors thought she would wake up soon without more problems. Meanwhile, my love was in a coma put on by the doctors to help her heal faster. They would reduce the pain medicine in a few days, once they thought she was safe. Susan wasn't killed right away because of her safety belt, but she must have been pressing the foot pedals hard when she crashed. The plane bent sharply after it hit the far side of the ditch, which had caused the control panel to fall down on both her legs. The surgeons saved her legs, but her right leg was so damaged that she would need a new knee. I believe that there's a person for everyone, except for those who do only bad things and then wonder why their life is so hard. They get what they deserve. I'm talking about good and humble people. They will find their special person. I had found Susan. She completed me, and it felt like everything was right. Now I faced the idea of spending the rest of my life missing her. And I was only 25. I had heard the tower recordings, and Susan's last words before the crash were, "Tell Erik I love him." Hearing that turned big, tough Erik, the respected leader of the group, into a crying baby. I wiped my eyes and cried, "What will I do without her?" But the fight wasn't over. Susan was giving it her all, and I planned to join her in the battle. With determination, I walked back to the nurse's station and called Jackie. She answered, "How is she?" I said, "Not good, but I'm staying with her until she gets better, so I need you to get Arnold to let me stay in her room the whole time." A call came into the nurse's station a half-hour later. The nurse answered it. A voice on the line talked for a minute. The nurse kept saying, amazed, "Certainly General Arnold, and of course General Arnold." Then she hung up and asked me, "Do you need a pillow?" I quickly got used to the busy hospital. Susan was moved to a private room by orders from Hap, and there was a comfy chair next to the window. For the next 5 days, I was either in that chair or finding something to eat. Sleeping while sitting up is a skill for the truly worn out. By day 5, I had gotten quite good at it. I talked to Susan as she lay there, her chest rising and falling while the machine helped her breathe. I hoped my talking might bring her back to me like a pilot follows a signal to land. I read her happy stories by Thurber and Runyon. I told her all about my life and our future plans, just so she could hear my voice. I found a small book of poems in the hospital library, Shakespeare's sonnets, and read every one to her. One line hit me hard. "Love doesn't change with the tiny hours and days, but stands strong even to the end." My eyes teared up. That happened a lot these days. I promised myself I would never give up and would never leave her. Then one bright Ohio morning, I woke from a short nap. I had slept 15 minutes at a time, day and night, for a week, and saw Susan looking at me. She was awake but still a bit groggy, like you are after a long sleep. She wasn't talking, just staring at me like she thought I was a dream. Seeing her awake was such a surprise that I yelped, which startled her. I probably scared her more when I ran out of the room and up to the nurse's station, where I stood, panicking until the nurse calmed me down enough to understand, "She's awake." Then it felt like half the hospital staff rushed into Susan's room. They kept me in the hall while they checked on her. Eventually, the old nurse came out, smiled kindly, and said, "You can see her now. She's very tired, so don't push her, but she's awake and will recover." I'm not very religious. I believe in a higher power, sure, but organized religion feels too much like a business to me, like people arguing about cars. So I haven't prayed much. My family went to Grace Church most Sundays, but Episcopalians expect that. Still, I felt like I owed something to that higher power, the one keeping the universe running smoothly. So I quietly said, "Thanks." The universe had decided that two humble humans were worth saving, no matter how tiny we are in the grand scheme of things, and I was grateful. In all relationships, there's a moment when you know for sure that the other person loves you. It might be a look or a gesture, and it strengthens the bond needed to get through tough times. I had that moment when I walked back into the room. The look of love on Susan's face said it all. I was speechless. My love had survived a nearly fatal plane crash, been in a coma for 8.5 days, and already had major surgery. But she looked just like the night I first saw her 4 years ago. She even had her usual floppy ears haircut. I walked to her bedside, and she slowly lifted her hand. I held it tight as we looked ahead to our endless future together. I watched Susan hobble towards me, leaning on her dad's arm. She wore a Santiago blue dress with a wasp black beret tilted on her head. Her hair was neatly tucked away. My best man, who was actually a woman, stood next to me, and the bridesmaids, all top-notch pilots, waited across from us. No one held flowers. The National Cathedral was huge, but we needed all the space. 2 of Georgetown's elite families were joining in marriage. Our dads, who paid for the big event, invited around 300 of their closest friends. It was the big society event of the year, but it wasn't a typical white dress wedding. Susan wanted it to show who she really was, a WASP ferry pilot, not a fancy Georgetown girl. So the wedding party wore their best WASP uniforms, with silver wings on their chest and AAF patches on their shoulders. Dee Dee and Dorothea, 2 B-29 pilots, and Florane, who flew me across the country at record speeds, dressed just like Susan, in a Santiago blue uniform with silver wings and medals, and uniform pants instead of skirts. Susan needed pants to hide the scars from her recent leg surgery. I thought our wedding was too soon after her accident, but Susan wanted the ceremony to make our bond official. Most people would still be in bed, suffering from the pain. Susan pushed that pain deep down and carried on. She was strong and determined, especially for us. That gave me hope for our future. Back then, most men had wartime friends, but WASPs were all women, and I was naturally a loner. I didn't have close male friends. One person, though, was brave and inspiring, Jackie Cochran. Word like girly never described Jackie. Strong, fearless, and impressive, but never girly. I asked her to stand with me. She felt honored. There was a bubble around the 6 of us as Susan and I exchanged vows. It came from shared struggles and facing death daily. We had done something special, something the regular folks in the church would never grasp. In just 4 years, Susan and I had grown from kids to adults, our souls shaped by conflict and our commitment to honor. My new wife was beautiful, but more importantly, she was strong and capable. She knew what self-sacrifice and duty meant, proven by her actions. As we settled into our house in Bethesda, the war ended. The surrender news was special to us because it was Tibbets flying a B-29 that convinced Japan to quit. Both Susan and I needed to find something to do after the war. Like many who worked hard to win it, adjusting to normal life was tough. It was even harder for us. The returning vets had the GI Bill and the thanks of a grateful nation. Susan and I, working for a civilian agency, had no military benefits. Plus, no one knew what we did because the WASP records were sealed. To most people, the WASP had something to do with beekeeping. It's hard to go through what we did and get no recognition or reward. But that was our situation at the start of our marriage. I was a one-armed high school graduate with no war record. Susan was a former commercial pilot who no airline would hire. Passengers back then wouldn't fly with a woman pilot. We had some family money, but both of us joining the WASPs instead of going to Princeton or one of the 7 sisters didn't sit well with our parents. So they didn't support us much. It was Susan and me against the world. I finally found a job that needed no education or experience. I took it because I had no other choice. No, it wasn't day labor. It was being a member of the House of Representatives. The only thing you need for that job is to know the right people. I met many important people while selling the WASPs on Capitol Hill. I had 4 special qualities. I was from the generation that just saved the world. I was one of the first wounded in the war. I was an accomplished pilot. And thanks to Jackie Cochran, I had strong backing from Hap Arnold and the AAF. So the local election parties courted me intensely. Both sides wanted me. I worked with Sam Rayburn, the Democratic speaker, who seemed like a professional, good old boy. His counterpart, Joe Martin, had a simpler background like mine. Plus, Truman's approval rating was very low. So I became a Republican with some Democratic views underneath. The Maryland 4th had an open seat and many new civil service residents. My parents loaned me money for a down payment to move to Bethesda. I think my dad gave me the money mostly because he didn't want to see me again. Maybe he would have understood if I had told him I was gay. But a Republican? Really? The 1946 midterm elections were tough because President Roosevelt was dead, and the Democrats couldn't agree on a new leader, so I won by a large margin. It was easy because the timing was right. Susan was a big help during the campaign. She was not only beautiful but also a female pilot. The media loved her pretty face and brave attitude. So here I was, a 25-year-old pilot with one arm, now working in the U.S. House of Representatives. I was lucky to have a good team of staff, but I quickly got rid of the ones who weren't good workers. Running a WASP training program teaches you how to find the good workers and get rid of the bad ones. I stayed in the same office in the Longworth building for the next 60 years. I eventually became the chair of House Armed Services, not because I was smart, but because I was there for a long time. I was good at making voters like me, which kept me in office. But I wasn't great at the actual work. That's where Susan came in. She was my strongest supporter and my partner. Susan wrote the important reports that made me seem smart about military matters. She could plan things and write them down well. I was just a former pilot with a friendly smile. We worked as a team, and I relied on Susan's wisdom and kindness to get through life. Epilogue: my granddaughter stared at Major Fuller like she was a hero. Then I heard a familiar voice say, "There you are, you old man. I've been looking for you." I knew that voice well. I had heard it every day for the past 67 years. Susan and I were a great pair. She had a slight limp as she attached my prosthetic arm. To me, she was as beautiful as the day we met, when she helped me wake up by waving smelling salts under my nose. She wore her blue uniform, which still fit her, and her hair was as white as mine. Her wrinkles showed the strong spirit within. I know young people think it's gross to see old people in love. I see it every time our big family gathers, 4 children and 9 grandkids. They just see 2 old, weak people. They don't see the brave young woman stepping out of a B-29 plane to hug the tough WASP leader. To them, we are just 2 old people waiting to die, invisible and unimportant. But I say bless them all. Someday, if God wills it, they will understand how it feels. Even so, Major Fuller had no problem showing respect to Susan. She gave her a salute and then took Susan's hand, saying, "We studied you in the academy. I wouldn't be here if you hadn't paved the way for us." My granddaughter looked amazed. The idea that her old grandma had anything in common with someone as impressive as Amy Fuller was unbelievable to her. To my granddaughter, Nana was the loving person who held the family together. Sure, she needed help with the stairs sometimes, but what had Nana ever done that was worth studying? Major Fuller leaned down to my granddaughter and said, "Do you see that medal your grandma is wearing?" My granddaughter saw the big gold medal around her neck. Amy continued, "Your Nana got that medal because she used to fly planes like I do. She helped the United States win World War II." At that, my granddaughter's eyes widened. Amy added, "More importantly, you can do the same now because your Nana proved that women can fly just as well as men." The look on Susan's face said it all. She didn't care much about a medal given to her in old age, but the idea that she had made it easier for her granddaughter to achieve her dreams meant everything to her. The WASP's accomplishments in World War II were significant, but what they did for their daughters and granddaughters made all their sacrifices worth it. I want to stress that most of this story happened just as described, and the names are real. The only made-up characters are the narrator, his wife Susan, and Major Fuller, who in real life is Captain Amy "Rebel" Fiedler. Everything that happened to the real people happened as I said. But other than their names and what happened, everything else is fiction. I didn't know them personally and don't know what they were like. Susan is based on all the women who served with the WASPs, reflecting their attitudes and journeys. I used the real-life deeds of Dorothea Strother for the B-29 incident. Dorothea was actually in the cockpit with Dee Dee Moorman on that flight. I included Dorothea in the wedding to make it up to her, and I didn't ask her to wear an ugly dress. WASP service is now public knowledge, and Jackie Cochran was a larger-than-life American hero throughout her career, including being the first woman to break the sound barrier and later setting up the Women's Astronaut Program for NASA. The Women Air Force Service pilots, WASP, became part of history on December 20th, 1944, at Sweetwater Field. General Hap Arnold spoke at their final ceremony. The WASP has finished its mission. They did their job well, but it wasn't easy. 38 WASPs died helping our country win the war. The Air Forces will always remember their service and sacrifice. We in the Army Air Forces are proud of you. We will always owe you a lot. But honestly, this wasn't true. Back then, no one wanted women pilots. For example, one WASP went to Northwest Airlines with her flying qualifications. She had a rare seaplane pilot's rating and a commercial rating. She had over 1,000 hours of flying time when most new male pilots had less than 400. Northwest was so impressed that they offered her a job as a stewardess. Society's rejection hurt these brave women. One WASP said, "I wanted so badly to keep flying, it kind of broke my heart, but that's okay because that was just how it was. Nobody even knew we existed. I kept my uniform, my pictures, my books. I told my kids, when I die, put them in my coffin." In some ways, this was the WASP's own doing. These capable women went back to normal life without complaining. They got no college benefits like other World War II veterans. They lived as regular wives and mothers. Also, the records of the WASP program were hidden for 35 years, so their contributions were little known. You don't need to tell me either. Other women's service branches had their deeds recorded publicly. It almost seems like someone wanted the WASP's story hidden because of how poorly they were treated. It took another mistake by the military to finally give the WASPs the credit they deserved. In 1971, the Air Force announced that, for the first time, women could be military pilots. This finally allowed the WASPs to tell their story. The WASPs could now talk about their flights and the dangers they faced. The American press loved it. Anyone fair and smart could see that the WASPs deserved recognition and military benefits. But it was the 1970s now, not the 1950s. Senator Barry Goldwater, himself a ferry pilot during World War II, was the main supporter for the WASPs. I mentioned him because the coincidence was too interesting. He wasn't involved in Cornelia Fort's death, but he knew sometimes you need to play tough to do the right thing. He introduced a bill in the Senate for military recognition of the WASPs and said he would attach a WASP amendment to every bill until it passed. Even though many opposed Goldwater's bill, the VA, American Legion, VFW, and even President Jimmy Carter, Congress finally did the right thing. They said the WASP service was active duty and gave honorable discharge certificates to all former WASPs. It might have been 37 years late, but at least it fixed a great wrong. Finally, in 2010, the WASPs were given the Congressional Gold Medal. Since this was nearly 70 years later, many medals were accepted by the pilots' adult children. I wonder what these people thought when they saw pictures of their moms as young, lively women smiling from airplanes. These women broke new ground. Winning in Congress meant that a few days after the law passed, General Hap Arnold's son, who also fought for the WASPs, could proudly tell a former WASP that she could put the American flag on her colleague's grave to celebrate the 4th of July. The fact is, many brave women in other services died during World War II. But the WASPs were the only group to have active service deaths. They lost 38 members in action and one was missing. They continued to serve without reward or recognition because they believed in America and what it stood for. And that, in my view, defines commitment, duty, and honor. Our freedom as Americans is backed by the courage of those who serve, and no group was braver or more dedicated than the World War II WASPs. For those interested, the National WASP WWII Museum is at Sweetwater Field. It opened on May 28, 2005, the 62nd anniversary of the first WASP graduating class. For the complete WASP history, visit the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center. The heroism and selflessness you see there will impress and move you. And if you want to see how far we've come since the WASPs started opening doors, Search for the YouTube video of Second Lieutenant Madison Marsh, Viper pilot, and the current Miss America. Daniel Tiberius Iverson, Ann Arbor, Michigan, July 2024.
What's up, story lovers? This is the Story Guy, and if you're hungry for crazy tales and mind-blowing narratives, you've come to the right place. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our weekly dose of crazy cheating stories, fun fiction and gut-ripping comedy from around the world. But that's not all. We also create our own original stories, and trust me, you won't find these anywhere else. Want even more spine-tingling reads? Head down to the description and grab our exclusive story collections. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.